Welcome to the Shipping Podcast, where you meet interesting maritime professionals sharing their passion for the shipping industry and their everyday job. I am your host. My name is Lena Gothberg. Welcome to the 58th episode of the Shipping Podcast. Today I'm going to introduce you to Christopher Rex. He is the head of research at the Danish Ship Finance. I went to Copenhagen late January, and this episode is recorded on the 24th of January. I think it's important that you keep that in mind, since some of the things that we are talking about is a little bit time sensitive. As you know by now, I am interested in the things that shapes our future. So listen very carefully to what Christopher is talking about. It's the little things that you need to pick up on if you're building your strategy for the future. I hope you will enjoy this 58th episode. That is so many more than I could ever have imagined. This is Christopher Rex for you. Welcome to the Shipping Podcast.
Thank you.
Could you please introduce yourself?
My name is Christopher Rex and I'm head of research for Danish Ship Finance, and I have been doing shipping research for the last 10 years.
What is your background? What did you do before?
I have a master's degree in economics from the University of Copenhagen, and I have been studying quite a lot abroad. I have taken a lot of courses both in corporate finance and in global macroeconomy. So my major, in fact, is Chinese macroeconomy with a focus on non-performing loans in the Chinese banking system. So that was my passion before shipping.
So how did you come into the shipping industry?
More or less not by accident, by coincidence. I had a good friend of mine started the research department in Danish Ship Finance 15 years ago, and I was enrolled as a PhD student in Beijing, and he asked me, when it was time to come home, he asked me whether I would come and say hello to his boss and see if it could be something for me to start as a shipping analyst with Danish Ship Finance, and yes, that was a success, and I've been here since, so very interesting industry.
What does the Danish Ship Finance?
Danish Ship Finance is a traditional bank. We do ship financing against the first priority mortgage in the ship we finance. We have been here since 1961. I've basically have the same business model since 1961, and we are, I can say, a quite conservative player within the field of ship financing. But of course, we are likewise challenged by the low markets as many other banks are these days. So even though that we have a conservative approach to credit risk.
But you do lend money also to non-Danish shipping?
Yeah. I think we have a small proportion of our loan book today is Danish in terms of number of clients. We have a few quite big clients, but in Denmark. But in terms of the number of clients, it's primarily an international or European, Scandinavian loan book. We have a bit of lending in North America and in Singapore, Hong Kong, but. We have the majorities in Nordic countries and Germany and Greece, a little bit in the UK.
So what is your responsibility? What do you do in your everyday job?
My everyday job is to identify risk, but also opportunities in the shipping markets in terms of asset classes. So what outlook do we see for the individual ship segments? And is there anything we should be in particular aware of in terms of future risk and asset pricing, basically. So we have a first priority mortgage in all the ships we finance. So the valuation of all the ships is close to my heart and close to my everyday jobs. We spend a lot of time on both evaluating existing ships we have in the portfolio, but also do some more predictions on where will the values be heading for the next 12 months or sometimes even longer. So we spend quite a lot of time on ship values, ship prices.
And you do release reports?
We do publish a biannual report we call Shipping Market Review. It is publicly available to all interested readers, and it is you can download it for free at our website. And we have done so for the last almost 15 years now. But for the last 5 or 6 years, it has got more attention than in the past. So we have been a little bit more direct in our expectations for the future. We were quite humble. We are still very humble, but we are risking our neck a little bit more these days and trying to predict which factors might impact the individual sub-segments in the future, rather than just describing some supply and demand. So these days we are spending a lot of time on how the global macroeconomic picture is is changing and also how technology is impacting in the industry. So that is some of the topics that take up most of my time for the last few years. So including topics like 3D printing, robotics, artificial intelligence, material science, and all these kind of topics that could be labeled the fourth industrial revolution somehow.
So what is your view there then?
I think that one of the most important parts to understand these days are that technology is changing the architecture of the global economy, and the fourth industrial revolution are changing the ability for emerging markets and developing economies alike to enter the global economy through job creation. I think if we all imagine the Chinese economy pre-WTO access in November 2001 and consider how would the Chinese enrollment into the world economy have looked like without the ability to create millions of jobs in the manufacturing sector. It is difficult to imagine that the Chinese construction boom and the Chinese basically high economic growth for more than 10 years would have evolved as quickly and as strongly as we have seen without the initial job creation. And I think that is basically what is at risk for many of the emerging economies in the nearby and the more long-term future here, that it will be difficult for them to create the needed millions of jobs to create economic growth. They might be able to create economic growth through, for example, manufacturing facilitated by robotics. That is what we call zero labor factories. But we have to remember that all forecasts these days are driven by 2 or 3 main topics, namely world population growth, urbanization, and basically the expectations that Chinese GDP and Indian GDP will continue to rise steadily and will basically lift all boats in the future in terms of whether you talk about energy demand or consumer spending, or in all major shipping related areas. We are looking into these 3 drivers of growth. And one of our key takeaways is basically that we need to focus on the economy's ability to create jobs, because if you are not creating jobs, you are simply living in the country, you're not a consumer. So, and I mean, a lot of people are talking about urbanization and population increases basically as a enabler for growth, and it is definitely needed to be present to be able to create economic growth, but it is not by itself creating economic growth. I mean, if economic growth was simply about moving people into cities and have a lot of people available, I think that a lot of African countries and countries in Southeast Asia would have created mega cities 30 or 40 years ago, if that was the only thing it took to create economic growth. Urbanization without job creation simply creates slums, and slums can be GDP negative for many years. So it is the technology angle here is very important, because it is raising the barriers to job creation for many economies, and that is likewise for the more developed part of the global economy. This is what enabled that what we can see reshoring of production closer to the consumers, whether it is in Europe or in North America and elsewhere. It could also be in Japan. We are seeing that production can move home, so to speak, because we can apply more and more robotics and have fewer and fewer hands in the production, and therefore have a more cheap production at home, even on a high weight scale. So for the developed economies, this presents some kind of opportunity to level out the impact of a demographic deficit where the global consumers are aging. But for the emerging and developing economies, this is raising the barrier to future economic growth. I think that is the 2 main themes to watch for the foreseeable future. And I mean, this is extremely important because in shipping, all ship segments without any exception are scheduled for growth. We see an order book to fleet ratio above 10% in all ship segments, and we see a quite young fleet in most ship segments. That means that we are not able to, we cannot scrap potential overcapacity if future demand do not fill the new vessels that come on stream. And future demand are expected to be quite modest, increasing something like 1 or 2% per year. So if all these ship segments are taking delivery of the order books, many of them could be subject to overcapacity for quite some years ahead of us. And this mechanism is, and now I talk as a banker with the first priority mortgage in the Ship Finance. This is extremely important because when we are faced with an outlook where we see premature scrapping as a necessity, This is about reducing the economic lifetime of vessels, basically, and that is a second-hand value negative. That basically means that we can see in the future, we can even see increasing freight rates, but still declining second-hand values, because the second-hand value are being reduced by a shorter cash flow period, a shorter economic lifetime of the vessel. So this is one of the key challenges, to my understanding, at least from a banker's perspective, for the years ahead of us, and that could take some years before this development is absorbed by scrapping.
You mentioned the fourth industry revolution.
Yeah.
Could you please just talk a little bit about that in case people are not familiar with
Yeah,
that?
but I think there's so many interpretations of what this is about. But I think that, to my understanding, what we are seeing is that we have started to see the combined effects of many of these new technologies, ranging from robotics to artificial intelligence, to 3D printing, to material science. We are basically starting to be able to increase the effectivity and the productivity of the global economy, so we can do more with less resources, and we can have a higher efficiency on our energy use. This is extremely good news for the energy outlook for the global economy. It is extremely good news for the environment. But it is a difficult perspective for the global shipping markets, because the global shipping markets are basically transporting all input needed from A to B for the different economies. So the fourth industrial revolutions are enabling new solutions to old problems, so to speak. And we can see it, for example, with car sharing schemes. Car sharing has become a viable option for many people in urban areas because of stronger computers, and because many of the people in the urban areas are having a smartphone where you can basically book your shared car. So this is really good for the consumers. They're getting more access to, for example, cars or to other commodity classes using fewer money. But it is in terms of material consumption and the need for future demand for various ship types, it is shipping negative. So the fourth industrial revolution is basically the step where we start to combine all the technology innovations we have seen in the past, and we are seeing that great synergies when we combine them, and a super interesting future, but also raising a lot of new challenges, not least to mention the cybersecurity risk, when we are starting to see all the information gathered around our behavior and various machines and technology. Yeah.
Do you see the maritime industry being prepared for this?
I think we are starting to see people are changing the mindset around what this is happening, but I think it is difficult, because we are still in an early stage of digitalisation in the maritime industry. Of course, we can see what is going on for the industries that we are serving, that this maritime industry is serving. For example, as mentioned before, the car industry. I think it is quite a big change when some of the larger car manufacturers are starting to call themselves a premium mobility provider instead of a car manufacturer, where they are selling miles instead of cars. So the maritime industry is recognizing that the underlying demand are changing, but a lot of people are still finding it, including us, finding it difficult to predict how will this change the need for ships in the future, and how quickly will it evolve. I mean, everybody do agree that great changes are at the horizons, but we're quite certain that we'll still need shipping in the future. We might see a change in the trading patterns, and we might see a change in the sizes of ships needed. And we could even see, for example, I think a lot of people agree that 3D printing, robotics, and artificial intelligence, when combined, could enable the manufacturing locations to relocate from, for example, Southeast Asia or China, closer to the consumers, and such a shift could have a quite significant impact on container vessels. So basically, buying large container ships is a long-term bet on manufacturing locations. But how quickly will this evolve, and how quickly will it impact the volumes shipped is a difficult task to judge. And likewise, when we look at self-driving cars, and in particular self-driving cars that is being that is electrified rather than driven by a combustion engine, this will clearly also change the outlook for gasoline and diesel. But then again, if you just turn to the energy side, renewable energy accounts for less than 3% of the global energy mix. It has seen great annual growth rates for the last 10 years, but still from a very low base. a lot of us would argue that renewable energy are evolving on an exponential curve rather than on a linear curve, meaning that it could take, for example, if you go from 1% to 2% to 4% and so on and so forth, it would take 7 doublings to reach 100%. If you start on 0.01% market share, and that could indicate that from a 3% percentage point base, we could have 10 years ahead of us before we are on a, I don't think that we will see renewable energy doubling each year, but we can see very strong growth rates, maybe not so much in the developed part of the world where we already have the grid solutions, that we have the gas-fired power plants, and we basically have a mature energy infrastructure. But this could impact new energy demand, in particular in Southeast Asia and Africa. And that is also the two regions where most people predict that future economic growth and future seaborne trade volumes should origin from. And again, with a positive order book to fleet ratio for the individual ship segments, this is something to watch, because if Africa and Southeast Asia to an increasing extent 1 year after the next are covering their energy needs from non-fossil fuel energy types, it clearly would impact not just the new ships entering, but also the existing vessels at sea, and therefore also provide a challenging outlook for many ship types. I mean, today it seems clear that a lot of people are regarding coal as something we have to phase out, and not least in terms of the COP21 and 22 meetings, but also on this 2 Celsius global warming topics, and that LNG should be the solutions of the future. So we should see a declining coal demand and an increasing LNG demand. But I'm still very uncertain whether solar and wind in less mature energy markets will be able to take some of the upside potential for LNG. LNG is costly infrastructure and have a high maintenance cost. But again, then it can provide a flexible and stable base load for energy grid. But if we are on locations where there's less mature grid, or there's no grid at all, I'm not so sure whether LNG will be the most suitable solution to future energy demand. But that will be the topic for our next shipping market review that will be published in May. And again, time will tell whether LNG will be the...
I think there is a Swedish ship owner who would argue that methanol could be one of the solutions for the future.
And I think that we will see a lot of maybe not new, but a lot of the smaller energy sources that will start to contribute more than what we have seen in the past. Methanol could be one, hydrogen fuel cells could be one. People are even starting to dream about nuclear fusion. That is a non-radioactive part of nuclear energy. And I think that we will see a lot of new technologies, or even old technology, but that will be develop in the future. But I think that the attractiveness of solar energy, in particular in these areas around Africa and Southeast Asia, where the sun is shining a lot, is that it is an extremely cheap and very scalable alternative to many other sources, and you can integrate it with existing solutions, for example, diesel engines or whatever you already have. So I think that the renewable side, primarily solar and wind, as for today, combined potentially with some kind of battery storage facilities, it could be a viable solution for the future energy needs in these regions. But again, many of the technologies are still on an early stage where we are seeing the technology are improving and the price are still declining. But I think generally speaking, we have to remember that the difference between renewable energy sources, to a large extent at least, and fossil fuel sources is that fossil fuels tend to become more expensive when a lot of people are using it, while renewable energy sources are technology, not a fuel, and technologies tend to be cheaper and better when a lot of people are using it. So I think it is too early to judge where we are heading. We can just see that both the technology and the price per kilowatt hour in terms of solar has now come at grid parity. So today it is as cheaply in many sunny regions to produce electricity through solar energy as it is through, for example, a gas-fired power plant. And we see a lower maintenance cost, and as far as I understand, also a much smaller investment initially, and it's much more scalable. You can basically put more solar panels to the solutions as your need is increasing.
The example of when US used to import a lot of oil from the Middle East, and now they don't anymore because of their own energy resources.
Yes.
That is an example of why different energy is having an impact on the shipping industry.
The US and the California example is extremely interesting, but I think both California but also the German example are also supported by government subsidies programs. I think the largest achievement we have seen in solar is, and it is developing on back of what we saw both in Denmark, but in particular also in Germany and in the US and California. But we have now seen the technology moving to a stage where it is competitive on a non-subsidy basis with, for example, a gas-powered power plants. Again, looking at the US energy mix, and I mean the shale revolution and the US tight oil production has changed the US energy needs, whether they are now importing much less than what it did in the past. But clearly the solar side of it has also been able to support the development of much more mature technologies in this area. And I expect to see continuing technological innovations in the solar industry for the foreseeable future. Not least in the US, but I think in particular also in all these less developed economies have plenty of access to sun, basically. So it's much more attractive in these regions, rather than for example, in Copenhagen, where the sun is shining less frequent. So,
do you dare to have any view on the US at the moment, where they are moving to?
I'm particularly not an expert in politics, and what I hope to see is that if it comes to a stage where, as far as I understand, we are already there, but I'm not an expert on US energy policies. But if we come to a point where it makes sense for individual consumers to make rooftop solar, not because of a subsidy, but because of a individual energy cost perspective, I think that solar energy can continue to expand in the US. Clearly, as a utility, on a utility scale, it might face more headwind. We have seen the new president in the United States have talked a lot about coal. I think it remains to be seen which actions he will take to support the US coal industry. But I hope that solar have come to a stage where it is able to continue developing and continue to increase its presence in the energy mix without subsidies. I hope that will be the case for the US going forward, and as well as for the rest of the world, basically. I think that will be good for all of us to have much more solar than fossil fuels. Clearly not for the shipping industry, and that is, of course, one of the things that we look a lot into. But it will be good for the environment and good for the global economy, basically, in the longer run.
I was thinking about the free trade.
Yes.
And that is also something that we are now seeing a little bit of change.
Yes, we're seeing a lot of movements both in the US but also in Europe, combined with migration flows. And we are basically seeing a lot of changes in the geopolitical landscape, and we are seeing the political landscape changing as well. In our latest shipping market review, we produced a 2030 scenario for world trade, where we predict that global seaborne volumes would increase by an annual average of 1% from now to 2030. And that is in the environment of the path, if you can say so. So clearly, if we do see some anti-trade measures or policies, it will be even more negative for the trade outlook. I do not dare to put any numbers on it, but I think it is important to remember that we have a demographic headwind. We're facing a demographic headwind in all the major consuming economies. To my understanding, including the US, it is true that if you look at the aggregated numbers, the US do not face an aging consumer base. But if you look at the purchasing power parity of the individual consumers, the rich part of the US consumer is about to retire, as well as on a similar path as the European consumers. The European consumers is about to retire. The Chinese consumers are about to retire. The Japanese and soon the South Korean consumers about to retire. So we have to be extremely careful when we judge future numbers and trades, because we have these headwinds both from the demographics as just mentioned, but also from the technology, where, as I just mentioned in the beginning of the interview, if technologies are making it more and more difficult for the less developed economies to integrate into the world economy. So these two mechanisms will in themselves provide some headwind for world trade volumes growth in the future. And of course, if we add on top of that some kind of anti-trade policies, it will be even worse. But our base case scenario today is a 1% increase in world trade volumes for 2030. Yes.
We're talking about the elderly generation now retiring. I thought that the pensionists nowadays, they still consume. They continue to consume.
They spend a lot, for sure. They spend a lot. Thank you for asking. It is an important aspect here. Elderly consumers continue to spend, but the changing behaviors are changing. They commute less, they buy fewer houses, they rebuild the houses less. They have fewer trips to IKEA or Walmart or wherever they are heading, and they are spending more money on healthcare, tourism, domestic services, going to the theater or go out and have dinner in the cities. So they're still spending, but their spending are becoming increasingly less trade intensive. So they are still contributing to GDP growth, but their contribution to GDP is less seaborne intensive, and that is also why we are seeing the decoupling between GDP growth and global trade volumes. We are seeing that as global GDP are rebalancing towards services, the GDP growth are becoming less and less trade intensive. And one of the big themes of the future should, to my understanding, be how will global trade volumes look like when the Chinese economy are rebalancing even more from heavy industries towards services. That we could basically see that what will happen to seaborne trade volumes when China stops building new cities, building new infrastructures, and turn to a more mature state where they are maintaining the cities rather than building new cities. I think that this could have a great impact on not just iron ore and steel, cement and all this, but also on diesel consumption and electricity consumption as well. So I think we have to watch out for this global rebalancing towards services that are changing the composition of world GDP to a large extent. This is a great importance for the global trade outlook. Not because we are predicting any kind of hard landing in China, or we still expect to see a firm GDP growth, but the nature of the growth, the drivers of the growth are about to change, and that alone will have a significant impact. So people have to understand that there's not enough I think a lot of people do already know it, but it is important to remember that it's not enough to see that global GDP are increasing 3 or 4% a year. It is extremely vital to look into which sectors are driving this growth and what kind of impact will it have for fossil fuel demand, for container demand and petrochemical demand and all these underlying ship segments.
So are we heading out of these cycles? I mean, shipping has always been cyclical and everyone is just waiting for the next upturn.
Yes. I think a lot of, in particular, investors in shipping are talking about the mean-reverting nature of the shipping industry. And I think that the cyclical nature of the industry will persist, but I think the mean-reverting nature of, for example, second-hand values, I think the basic mechanisms are still there, but at the moment, basically, we need to scrap a lot of vessels. We have the overcapacity is too big in too many segments. The age profile is too young, so it will take some years before we can return to a new kind of equilibrium. And demand is significantly weaker than what we have seen in the past. That basically means that it will take more years before demand have absorbed a given overcapacity. In the past, we have had a much better balance between the order book and the proportion of the fleet that can be considered scrapping candidates. So in the past, if we have had a overcapacity in 1 year, it will take maybe 1 or 2 years, a little bit longer, to absorb the overcapacity through a combined effort of scrapping of older vessels and demand increases. These two mechanisms are much weakened today, and in the segments where we do scrap, we scrap young vessels, and these vessels are basically destroying value. So I think that the cyclical nature of the shipping industry will persist, but at the moment we are having some factors that are postponing the upside a bit. Whether that is 2 years or 3 years or even longer, it is difficult to say, but I think one of the things that is needed to restore the balance between supply and demand is that people stop ordering new vessels. That is, of course, very bad news for the shipyard industry that is heavily oversupplied at the moment. There's basically too many yards out there. But for the shipping industry, we really need to see very, very few new ship orders being placed in the future. And it might be that we will, in a few years' time, we'll start to see, if I'm right in the prediction that future demand will be needing different ship size and be trading in different trading routes. New demand will be from a new kind of vessels, but that could also mean that we will have to continue scrap vessels prematurely, much longer than currently expected.
What do you mean with new kinds of vessels?
I mean, for example, if you look at the container industry, a lot of people have been investing in super large vessels for the last many years, arguing that it was all about marginal cost per move TEU. If we start to see manufacturing relocate closer to the consumers, in North America and Europe, but also in Southeast Asia, it will be difficult to utilize these super large vessels. So it might be the case that we will need to scrap them after year 15 or maybe even before. And then again, we will start to need smaller vessel sizes. That could be some of the segments that have been almost neglected for the last 10 years or so. We have seen if you take the size of the old Panama Canal ship sizes that have been able to go through the Panama Canal in the past, geared or not geared, have basically seen very little fleet renewal in the past and a quite old age profile of the fleets. In a more regionalized container trade, we could start to see a much greater demand for smaller vessel sizes. I think it is difficult at this moment to predict what smaller vessel sizes would be, but it do not need to be 10,000 TEU. I think it could be significantly smaller. Not all of them need to be geared. It is a bit odd to see that a lot of these old Panamaxes are being scrapped these days very early. I understand perfectly why these days, but it could be that similar sizes could be demanded in 5 years' time or something like that, or 10 years. That is the key to the problem here, that it's difficult to know how quickly this, for example, relocation of production will happen, and therefore also should you keep your older vessels or should you scrap them now? I mean, for all the vessels that have a negative contribution to the company's cash flow, it looks wiser to scrap them now than to keep them. And this is basically what we see today, that even as young vessels as 9-year-old vessels in the Panamax segment has been scrapped in 2016. So I'm sure that had been a difficult decision by the company that did it, but I think it is, from a market perspective, it makes sense.
Has it got any impact that for instance, in Europe, it's a big congestion and the politicians is now trying to get more goods on keel. So trying to use the inland waterways, which is a big discussion in my home country.
Yeah.
Can you see that happening? And then smaller vessels probably will be there.
I have to say that I'm not an expert in regional issues. I hope it'll be good. I mean, I hope it will be successful. It'll clearly be good news for a lot of the smaller ship owners. But I do not really know what is the most likely outcome here. So I wouldn't make any...
You would say pause on that
no,
one. Yeah,
yes.
That's okay. It's a segmented industry. I mean, most ship owners own 5 to 10 ships.
Yeah.
There are the big ones, the dragons, the big
Yes.
ones. But usually it's like family-owned business
Yes.
with 5 to 10 ships. And that is also why it's hard to predict and to know. And
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, again, it is... if we look into a future where we expect to see the shipping industry becoming digitalized, one of my personal main concerns is that we could start to see an industry that is using some kind of trading platform much more than what we see today, or we are basically not seeing them today. But the trading platforms are very present in most other industries around us, whether you will call it car sharing or Airbnb, Uber, but also you can see that all these open source platforms, for example, the example of Android is also a way of dictating standards in an industry. And if we are starting to see these kind of solutions where more and more people are being forced to handle, basically to fix their ships on digital platforms, more and more small ship owners could become Uber drivers rather than Uber. And it is clearly, from the Uber example, much more profitable to be Uber rather than being the Uber driver. And I think that is one of the key challenges. What kind of changes do we need to see in the business model and in the industry's value proposition in a digitalized future? How do individual ship owners continue to earn money in an industry where most, if not all, in today's market are price takers in terms of freight rates and are subject to these very volatile and cyclical asset values? It is a difficult challenge ahead of us to see what kind of changes to the architecture of the shipping industry is needed to be able to impact your own profitability.
do you think that will come from outside or from the inside?
I hope it will come from the inside, but what we've seen in many other industries is often that it is at least a third-party entrant that changes or at least impact the way the industry is working and significantly streamline some parts of the industry. I mean, if you look at the music industry, all the streaming solutions, for example, there's a lot of them, but it has really changed the way that all of us are purchasing our music. And if you're seeing a similar way of fixing a cargo or fixing a ship, it is also changing the way that the ship owners are earning money. So one of the things that we hope is that we can see that the data the ships are producing can be a valuable asset. And it is my hope that we can start to see some kind of solution where the individual owner are able to get some kind of income or from the assets the ships are producing somehow. So the data side becomes valuable, not just the assets. And what we have seen in many of the digital industries, data can be even more valuable than the assets. So hopefully we see a potential upside here for parts of the industry. But I'm afraid that it might not be for all. So, but fingers crossed that we'll find a smart solutions that could be as good as possible for the industry. But I sincerely hope that the digitalisation of the industry could be a industry-driven process rather than a third-party disruption of the industry. So even though it could be difficult to disrupt yourself, I think it is better to disrupt yourself than being disrupted by others. So fingers crossed. It is too early to say where we are heading, but I have hopes for the future at least.
We are often looked upon as the Cinderella industry. No one knows about us, so we are just working that.
Yes.
How could we become more visible, do you think?
It is an extremely difficult question to answer. I mean, the closer you are to the consumer, I think the more visible you can be. And for many parts of the shipping industry, we are not that close to the consumer. And clearly, if we can make logistic solutions where we can produce better access from not just from port to port, but from door to door, that might be possible to increase the visibility of the industry. But then again, if we take the Uber example, we talk about the Uber, we do not talk about the individual assets that are transporting us or transporting the goods we need. So I think it's a difficult task, but hopefully some people smarter than me will be able to help us with that.
Yeah, but also I think that the transparency that will be needed in the future might have an impact also on visibility.
I think that is in a digitalized future where we have a much greater transparency and we have much more equal access to informations, that can give some great advantages for most parties involved in the industry, and you should be able to price risk and price behavior much more accurate. But whether that will make a public awareness of the industry much stronger or not, I don't know. To my understanding, there could be a lot of value in this transparency and this better access to adequate information for the industry. But whether this is a beauty contest, I think it is too early to say. I cannot see it clearly how that should evolve.
We also have a new generation of people in the industry coming along.
Yes.
I see a lot of third or fourth or fifth generation of ship owners now coming in.
Yeah.
And they are like 35, 40 years old.
Yeah.
And they are used to doing things in a different way.
Yeah. Hopefully that can be one of the driving forces around the changed vision or the changed understanding of tomorrow's industry. Because I think that, for example, when we look at the millennials today, fewer and fewer of the millennials are getting a driver's license, for example. They would much rather have the latest iPhone with a good data subscription on, so they can get access to all these sharing economy solutions, whether that is a car or a hotel room or whatever they need. And that is also one of the factors that are impacting the outlook for the industry, that the consumers are changing. So I think the new generation in the shipping sector could also be a contributing part to seeing a different understanding of tomorrow's value drivers and how the industry will evolve. But I think in all cases it is, I think we need to adapt to an industry that sees much less growth in demand and where we will see much more transparency than what we've been used to in the past. And that could drive prices, support that we will see lower prices for longer, if you could say so, because we are breaking down some of the barriers that has been enabled by a lack of transparency in the past. I think a new generation could hopefully change I don't know if hopefully, but I think it could change the understanding of the future.
Who would you be interested in listening to in the shipping podcast?
A lot of is super interesting insights to get from a lot of people. I mean, everybody that have a critical view on whatever topic they're sitting on is, to my understanding, super interesting. And all the people that try to apply some of these, both new trends but also existing dynamics, to try to predict where will this industry be heading and how could it impact many of the players within it. I mean, a lot of talk have been going on in terms of cybersecurity, and I think this is one of the topics that is super interesting to follow in the future. Where, if you imagine a future where the connectivity and the Internet of Things are super integrated in the industry, we will see a lot of new information and a lot of new insights to be acquired. But it's also give us a risk exposure that is different from what we know today, and that demands a change of mindset, to my understanding, on how to navigate in this new risk profile. So I think there's a lot of smart people out there that is working on increasing the connectivity, increasing the understanding of what is going on, and making this into a new value proposition for the industry, basically, but also a new risk profile for the industry. And I'm not an expert in these fields, so I really look forward to listen to all the strong forces that are trying to guide us through the future in terms of connectivity in our industry. Fingers crossed to learn more about that in the future.
Thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
It's very interesting to listen to you, as always.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Christopher. Thank you for taking the time to sit down with me and giving my listeners your view of the coming future. As you heard, you can free of charge download the reports that the Danish Ship Finance is releasing every quarter. Go to their website and you will find them. At this point of the episode, I usually share something from the behind the curtains of my podcasting journey, I would call it. Well, today I can share with you that I haven't got any microphone, so I am recording this on my iPhone. My microphone is in Copenhagen and I am not. And tomorrow I am going to Stockholm, and then maybe my microphone will be in Gothenburg. So it's a little bit of a logistical problem. I hope you can oversee that this intro and outro is not what it usually is. I promise you it will be better the next time. And I hope you realize that I haven't got much to say at this point. And I know I have promised you a newsletter. I haven't got around to do that either. So back to the desk, working, and tomorrow I'm on a train. I hope you're all well. I got a new interview lined up for you. Everything will be so much better in the 59th episode, which is due in 2 weeks' time. So from me to you, over and out. Thank you for listening to the Shipping Podcast. Don't forget to tell everyone that you meet that there is a shipping podcast where the maritime professionals are talking about their everyday job.